It's somehow already a new year. It's my favorite time to reorganize my reading backlog, set up my new reading log, and of course the best part, pick my first book. So with the start of the new year, I wanted to take some time to prioritize the books in my TBR and figure out what types of books I actually wanted to try and read this year. So first, I'd love to finish series that I've started last year, in particular Dune and the My Brilliant Friend series. But also I'd love to start reading a few more classics this year. I've started with a few last year, like Pride and Prejudice and Little Women, and I became obsessed with those books and those characters. I absolutely cannot stop talking about them. One of my new favorite pastimes is to play Which March Sister Are You? I think I'm a Meg who wishes she were Amy. But I'd also love to stop procrastinating on some books that I've been pushing back on my TBR for what feels like years now. One of which is Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. I can't remember when I got this book. It must have been like years ago now. I've started a few times, I've never finished it because it is over 1,000 pages long. And so to be honest, it kind of scares me. It is supposedly a tragicomedy about the pursuit of happiness in America, which sounds interesting, I guess. But I feel like it's one of those books that I heard a lot about in the past and people seem to really like. So hopefully I can get to that at some point this year. But for now, let's pick out our first book. So I actually just got a bunch of new books from the library. I'm a Libby Kindle user primarily. I would love to have more physical books, but I live in a small SF apartment, so there just simply is not the space for that. But these are the new books that I've gotten. And so, to be honest, I have already picked a first book, and I actually already finished it as well. It was This Is How You Lose the Time War, which I'd give a high 3, low 4 rating. Essentially, there is a war going on between these two opposing sides, and there are these two agents across those two sides who are rivals and start communicating, and it kind of grows into something more. Conceptually, it was very cool and fresh. Personally, I didn't love how it leaned so abstract and was kind of loose with how things worked in the world. It made for a cool concept, but sometimes kind of just left me a little confused. So after a book like that, I like to go for a pick that's maybe a bit safer, a bit more well-loved and recommended, and is an author that I already know I love. So next we're gonna go with Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. I've read Clara and the Sun and The Remains of the Day before, which The Remains of the Day is probably one of my favorite books of all time. It's about a butler who reflects on his life over the course of a short vacation. I think it's his first vacation, and he reflects on his life and the values that he lived it by and the cost of having lived the way that he had. It's really good, and I'll also leave a link below for his Nobel lecture, which a friend recommended to me recently, which also was really good. If you're a fan of Ishiguro, you have to check it out. He essentially talks about how he started writing, the impact of his identity, and his thinking behind some of his books. Highly recommend, but for now, let's get into Never Let Me Go. So actually it's a little later, and I ended up finishing 2 more books. Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. I finished that one, and I also finished Whale Fall by Elizabeth O'Connor. I want to come clean and say that's not normal for me to read 3 books in 1 week, but all of these just ended up being really short. But I wanted to talk about them because I think we have our first 5-star read. So first, let's start with Never Let Me Go. So, to be honest, this book was incredible. I mentioned before that I read The Remains of the Day, also by Kazuo Ishiguro. Loved it, and this was actually very reminiscent of it. I think if you took The Remains of the Day and My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante and put them together into one book, you kind of get Never Let Me Go, but in the best way possible. So I won't spoil the premise of the book, even though personally I really don't consider it a spoiler because I feel like this book is really more about the characters and their relationships. So it's about these 3 friends who are at this boarding school together, and it's all told from the perspective of the main character, Kathy, but in years in the future. And she's essentially reflecting on all of her times at school with her friends Ruth and Tommy, and you get to hear stories of them growing up in a really nostalgic but also contemplative way. One thing that I think Ishiguro does really well in this book is actually one of the main reasons why I loved My Brilliant Friend, which was the portrayal of these relationships between these characters. All of them are super complex, and that's what makes them seem super realistic. It is kind of a heavy read, it will make you feel, but not because it's particularly dark or anything. I just feel like it's really honest about life, the time we have, and kind of what it means to be human. All of this to say, it has to be 5 stars. And so the last book I read this week was Whale Fall by Elizabeth O'Connor. And I'm really trying to remember where I heard about this book because I remember I added it to my TBR a while ago now. And that's something that I feel like I really need to work on with my TBR. I'm kind of thinking that I need to write every book in my TBR down now because I'd love to leave a note about what intrigued me about the book initially or who even recommended it to me. But anyway, it's a historically inspired novel about a fictitious Welsh island where it's super difficult to live there, and increasingly so as people continue to leave for the mainland. And it's from the perspective of a young woman who lives there with her family. And you can almost consider it a coming of age of sorts. But it's O'Connor's debut novel, which is insane. The writing was very impressive, especially how O'Connor describes the world and even within the dialogue. And I say this sometimes where I love descriptive writing, give me all of the details. But if you're going to tell me something, I want it to have a purpose. I want it to be communicating something to me about that world, about that person. And this is exactly what I feel O'Connor does really well. So overall, I would say great writing, maybe a bit of a quieter read, something that I personally would want to be in the mood for, but a solid 4-star read. But yeah, let me know if you've read any of these books in the comments, and I'll see you next time.